Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra nuggets and information to give you a greater understanding of the war at large in Ukraine. Where should we start? Well, let's go to just a pretty normal tweet here from War Monitor saying Ukrainian long-range artillery overnight, so HIMARS, GIMLRS, hit and destroyed 2 radar stations, an ammunition depot, and one other important military object suitably vague. When I give you the daily sort of update in the morning for the Russian losses as reported by the Ukrainian General Staff, there is this one at the end that says special equipment. So it's going to be interesting to see whether you'll get a +2 in the special equipment tomorrow as a result of 2 radar stations being hit. Radar stations are super important to be hit because these are the installations that detect drone activity, fixed-wing aircraft activity, helicopter activity, missile activity, and in spotting them, acquiring the targets, it allows the missile systems to take these out, or as whatever air defense is being used. So to get protection from this kind of aerial threat, as in these air defense systems, the Ukrainians need to be taking out radar stations. This is what happens in SEAD operations, supremacy of air defense operations. So whereby usually fixed-wing aircraft will go and take out things like radar stations. So I wonder whether this is HARM missiles being sent from Ukrainian fighters or multi-role aircraft, sending off these missiles that detect radar or radiation from radar installations and then take out those radar installations. That then allows Ukrainian drone activity or fixed-wing aircraft or helicopter activity to happen with greater ease in the air without the threat of being taken out. So you can talk about, I would say something like 2 radar stations is possibly more important than like 2 of anything else that you might see on here. I don't know, you can couch these in many different ways, but the point is that is hugely important. 2 radar stations is a big loss for the Russians, and that means wherever they were hit, there would then be a lack of that kind of coverage, and you'd want to really take advantage of that. So say you hit 2 radar stations near each other, then that particular place will be a super area you would assume to get in some aerial attack on the Russians. So anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about Igor Girkin, Igor Strelkov. So there's this tension in the Russian military space, I guess, between Prigozhin of the Wagner PMC, so the mercenary contingent, the Russian MOD, and Gerasimov and Putin and all the kind of orthodox Russian military figures, and then the military bloggers, people like Igor Girkin, who in 2014 was in charge of the separatist forces in the illegal Little Green Men invasion of the Donbass. He's then gone back to being this kind of very loud military blogger. He did go to the front line, he volunteered, then the papers were kind of absent and whatever, and he sort of came back with his tail between his legs somewhat, but he's been exceedingly critical of a whole swathe of Russian military activity, from the kind of the military decision making at the top down to the fact that the troops on the ground don't seem to have an idea of what they're doing in Ukraine, like why they're there, what the objective is. They have no clear idea of the objective. They don't know what they're doing there. They've been mobilized, sent there to have this war that they don't necessarily agree with, or if they do agree with it, they don't really know much about it. And so anyway, the military bloggers, there's this tension between these kind of 3 entities. And Igor Girkin is interesting because when he's critical of Russia, your ears prick up, not just because it confirms what you want to hear, and you might get a sense of confirmation bias, but often sometimes when you're doing like historical analysis, it's called enemy attestation. So if you're attacking a position and someone who's your enemy is making the same claims as you, then enemy attestation has a greater value than your own attestation. In other words, like if you're looking here at Ukrainian propaganda and you're making claims about Russian losses or Russians being crap here or whatever, then there's a bit of a problem because that's Ukrainian propaganda. And and thus it's propaganda, right? And you are questioning its truth. But if the same claims are coming from the Russian side, then there is more, arguably, there is more credibility in those claims. So when Igor Girkin says things like this, it's important because it confirms what Ukrainians are sometimes saying, or gives you extra insights, and it has that extra value of credibility. But then, of course, you could argue that this itself is kind of internal propaganda, propagandizing his own position, and is it trustworthy? But there are layers of trustworthiness, right? But anyway, uh, he is saying here that things like the offensive in Mariinka has been stopped. Same with Avdiivka, and Vuhledar is not going well. All the kind of things that some Ukrainians are saying, people like myself are saying, and it makes you go, okay, there could be something in this. So he has, for example, as War Translated says, Girkin's update this morning indicates that Russians are not seeing any major success in Vuhledar. The city is heavily defended, and attacking it is very disadvantageous for Wagner. Same with the south of Avdiivka, Russian advance is stalling. So he says, on the Donetsk front line, this is Igor Girkin himself, the offensive in Mariinka has been stopped at the moment, despite all the loud statements about almost there. It was impossible to completely liberate the village before the end of January. Sidebar, village, town, city. Right, British English is evidently different from everywhere else in the universe. A city for me is 100,000 people, plus a town is somewhat less than that. A village is not going to have anything more than 100 houses or whatever. But it appears that many other countries around the world use the English language somewhat differently, and they say a village is a city, is a town, and there's kind of, you just intermingle those words. They're interchangeable. Uh, but in British English, certainly not the case. So Mariinka is not a village. It's at least a town. You could get away with calling it a city, but there you go. Fierce fighting in the area of the village of Vodyane, which is a village. So let's go to Vodyane. Let's have a little look at the claims here and give you some geographical context, because you might not follow my frontline updates and know where everything is, so on and so forth. So you got all this frontline here. You got Kupiansk down to Kremina, and then if we come further down south, we have Bakhmut, and further down south we have the large Ukrainian city of Donetsk, which is in presently occupied territory, and a satellite town of that is Avdiivka, which has been under attack for an awful long time, but there's not been a lot of movement. And just down south, there has been recent movement in terms of territory acquisition for the Russians, as they have taken this actually quite important village of Vodyane. Is arguable as to how much of Vodyane, which is a long thin village, goes across there, that they control. It's a bit like Pervomaisky, but it gives them access to Tonyenka and Siverny up north, and allows them to have some success in this gradual encirclement of Avdiivka. Anyway, they have had some success, the Russians, in Vodyane, and then have stalled, and then have seemed to have lost a lot of equipment around there. Anyway, Igor Girkin, the point of me going through all that is Igor Girkin is saying the same thing. So fierce fighting in the area of the village of Vodyane, south of Avdiivka, also did not bring decisive success to the Russian armed forces, or rather to the units of the former DPRPM corps, now listed as the Russian armed forces. Now, this is interesting. So DPR being the Donetsk People's Republic, a separatist militia that now appears to be listed with the Russian armed forces. So I don't know what to make of that, but I don't know whether he's angry with that or whether he's celebrating that. It's difficult to tell from the words alone. After initial successes and breaking through the front lines of the enemy's defences, the offensive got stuck due to heavy losses in the infantry assault units, lack of artillery ammunition. Okay, so before we go on, wow. So he is telling us, he's confirming that yes, they have stalled here and they have lost lots of, in this case, infantry, and he's saying that they do not have enough ammunition for their artillery, which is what Ukrainians have been saying for a long time, and you've seen this with the huge drop in rate of fire of Russian artillery from 60,000 rounds a day, shells a day, as we have seen at the peak of the war, down to 20,000, maybe even less than 20,000 at the moment. Some saying it's a 75% reduction. So there are claims that there is parity now between the shells being used between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which is massive. So, due to lack of heavy losses of infantry, lack of artillery ammunition, and in general poor technical support for the attacking units and their low numbers. So it's like if you're going to attack, you've got to use a lot of people, a lot of mechanized equipment, a lot of people, the combined arms working well, and you've got to have really good artillery support and aerial support as well. But that's not happening if you have these half-assed. So if you have these half-assed attempts at attacking, you will lose more people. If you're going to flood them and have a Pyrrhic victory, you're going to lose a lot of people, but you're going to get territory and you will eventually kind of, scare quotes, win. If you do it half-heartedly, then you're not going to get that territory and you'll end up losing a greater proportion of your troops, maybe even a higher real-term number of troops. So either do it properly or don't do it at all, is I think what I would take from this. And Russia appeared to be doing it half-assed in a lot of places. Pavlivka and Vuhledar, Vodyany and Avdivka. Bakhmut is looking more like the full-on Pyrrhic victory, which is kind of doing it properly, scare quotes, which is trying to solve a problem with a human solution, just throwing troops at that. Oh yeah, okay, they do have some technical advantage in some of the Wagner drone activity. They arguably have an artillery advantage in the area, and in fact, there's evidence that they're pulling ammunition from other places, like here in Avdivka, pulling ammunition from there and sending it to Bakhmut to allow them to have success, at least in Bakhmut. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off on one. At the same time, no one from the people at the front can definitely tell me whether they took Vodyany completely or only partially. And that is arguably because actually it would be pretty difficult to take it fully, because this Vodyany appears to go from all the way here over really to somewhere north of Pervomaisky and Perekrastok. So yeah, where it's highly unlikely that they'd have taken Vodyany to over there. So where is it along this kind of line that Russia have taken Vodyany, and it's highly unlikely that they will have taken it completely. Anyway, he continues. At Vuhledar, the brave statements about the breakthrough directly into the town, as expected, turned out to be a lie. So this is harsh language, right? He is making some big accusations here that this is a lie. As expected, because Deniska Pushilin yelled the loudest about this, and he is only an expert in lies, theft, and cheating. Wow. Okay, that is a massive accusation. Who the hell is Pushilin, you ask me? Well, he is a Donbass region politician who's serving as head of Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR, since 2018. So this is he is basically your head of the DPR, head of the Donetsk People's Republic. So if we sort of zoom out of here, you've got Donetsk being this whole oblast area. Coming down there, you can see the faint lines going up there. It's not very clear on this map. So this is Donetsk, includes Mariupol as well, and obviously the city of Donetsk. So he's in charge of that whole region, and he's been shouting about how successful they've been there. And Girkin is saying, that ain't true. And he basically says he's full of lies, which is really, really interesting. The village, which has long been turned into a single fortress, is a compact micro-district of high-rise buildings in the middle of continuous flat fields, but it was not possible to take it in a jump. Now, what's he talking about? He's talking about Vuhledar, not Avdivka. So this is down here, as you will know if you've been following me for the last week or so. Vuhledar on the higher ground here. You've got Pavlivka and Mikilska on the lower ground. They are trying to attack through two different directions, sort of up, or more like that actually, from Pavlivka in that sort of direction, trying to fix the Ukrainian defenders there, whilst then doing this kind of attack from Mikilska up through these dachas, these other sort of low-rise, more, I don't know, rural buildings, if you like, down here. And they did get a foothold a few days ago, and then they've been subsequently repelled from there. And the Ukrainians just having the high ground, having the vista, the vision, the from these high-rise blocks of flats, they're able to get line of sight through downhill to all of these places and get the quite effective Ukrainian artillery in the area to pummel these guys. And the Russians have lost huge amounts of troops and mechanized equipment. And in fact, this is very similar to when they previously tried to attack. Was it back in November? And what they did, they were even less clever then, and they just literally just did that over and over and over, attacking into Pavlivka, taking a bit of Pavlivka, trying to get more and more, but all the time being absolutely hammered, and in the end, sort of retreated with their tails between their legs, having not really achieved anything other than getting a lot of their troops and equipment killed and destroyed. So similar sort of stuff's going on now, but attacking from two directions, which is marginally more intelligent, but really not going very well. And this is being confirmed by Girkin. Now, the troops trying to storm it are in an extremely disadvantageous position compared to the defending units of the armed forces of Ukraine, who hide in concrete cellars and have the ability to adjust artillery fire at a considerable distance, even without the use of technical means. So what he's essentially saying exactly what I've just said, that they have the line of sight. They don't even need to get drone activity up there. They can literally see where the targets are and then radio that back to the Ukrainian forces or artillery that is in place, back here or whatever, and that just hammers the area quite successfully. If you look at the distance from Pavlivka to, I don't know, let's go all the way back there. That's 15 kilometers, right? That is easy distance for artillery. In fact, you can, if you're using things like Caesars, right, which has 40-kilometer range, you can have artillery all the way back there. So Pavlivka is basically in in range of Ukrainian artillery, for, as far away as, well, could be circling. I don't know. It could look like something like this. Anything around there can hit Vuhledar, can hit Pavlivka. Arguably, it depends what. If it's just your M777s or whatever, then maybe it might look like this. But the point is that Vuhledar is going to get, or Pavlivka is going to get, one hell of a hammering, and quite easily so. In total, says Girkin, there have been several dozen of them in 11 months, attempt to ram the long-term defense of the armed forces in Ukraine on the Donetsk front, with frontal strikes resulted only in local tactical successes with very serious losses. So when you're pro-Russian on my thread saying, oh, what's your proof for Russians losing more than Ukrainians? It's like, okay, there's plenty of proof. We've got visual confirmation of 3-to-1 equipment losses, which has to translate somewhere to. It might not be 3-to-1 in troop losses, but it's going to be more than 1-to-1. You've got video evidence of troops being hit more than Russians are producing video evidence. You've got anecdotal evidence. You've got the nature of offensives into urban areas where you need, I don't know, 7-to-1, 9-to-1 at least outnumbering to get the desired effect. If you're going to go anything than less than that, you are just going to suffer more casualties than the defenders. That's the nature of the beast. And you put all these things together, and then you get people like Girkin saying we are having considerable losses. Then I am really confident in saying the Russians are losing more troops than the Ukrainians in these sorts of places. So sorry, this is taking me a long time to talk about because I'm banging on. So very serious losses. The only benefit is that the activity of the Donetsk fighters and volunteers fighting here undoubtedly contributes to the success of the Wagner in the battle for Bakhmut, forcing the armed forces of Ukraine to spend tactical reserves and ammunition, which the Ukrainians also have not loads, to repel other attacks in other areas. Now this is, I would agree with him here. There is report that certain reserves that were going to be sent to Bakhmut had to be redirected to the Vuhledar area, and indeed possibly even down to the Zaporizhia area in the Orkhiv. So these kind of spoiling attacks, as they might be, rather than being full-on offensives, particularly in the Orkhiv area, rather than being full-on offensives, these are spoiling attacks to fix Ukrainian troops that then allows the troops in Bakhmut to take advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians are struggling to get reserves there because they are being sent elsewhere, is the theory. And I think that is probably happening to some degree. Okay, moving on to sort of other subjects, but we'll touch on what we've just been talking about. This is Dmitry War Translated, again doing a good job this time translating Arestovych, who used to be the spokesperson for Ukraine on a daily basis, saying stuff, and he's resigned from that position, but he still says exactly what he said. So he's just not doing it in an official capacity. You have to wonder whether how much of this is accurate, how much is propaganda, so on and so forth. So it's about unpicking that, but it's always interesting to hear what he has to say. On fighter planes and missiles for Ukraine, Arestovych says the UK and Poland are suggesting supplying Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles, airplane-based. Ukrainian representatives have also stated that Ukraine needs jet fighters, ideally 180 plus, to protect the whole territory of Ukraine. I mean, yes, in an ideal world, yeah, you'd have endless amounts of these things, I guess. But what's realistically are they likely to get? Have these things been put in place already? There's these competing sort of theories about whether Ukrainians have been being trained for the last 10 months on F-16s, whether F-16s are already been given a green light and they are getting ready to go. And then you hear things like, oh, we've just given a list of people that we think can be trained for F-16. Okay, so you haven't been training them. And then it's just confusion. And then people saying, well, we're thinking about giving F-16 in the future. We'll talk about the next Ramstein, all this kind of stuff. And you're like, okay, so has this been like secretly agreed upon already? Have there been people training for 10 months or not? I don't know. So he continues to Arestovych. The F-16 coupled with an adequate support system would be a bigger game changer than HIMARS and are superior to Russian aviation. That's a really big claim. HIMARS have been a huge game changer. Would aviation do that? And it's again about SEAD operations, suppression of enemy air defenses. Those F-16s are only as good as the lack of air defense allows them to be. Okay, so if you want to get the most out of those planes, those jets, you need to take out those radar stations. You need to take out those surface-to-air missile systems, which have a pretty long range. And how many of those have Russia got operational behind the lines? Who knows? Probably quite a lot. So yes, they might be a game changer, but before you get to change a game, or in order to change a game, you need to take out those air defenses, and that is much harder. It's easier said than done, for sure. The supply of warplanes and longer-range missiles may be the main focus of the next Ramstein meeting, as these are weapons that will put the final nail in the Russian army's coffin. It's big talk there. Russia's artillery and tank problem. Okay, there's a few. I'm going to continue reading this down to about there because it's all interesting. The Russian artillery. The current average number of artillery shells used by the Russian army is 15,000 per day. So this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It was 60,000, so that is a 75% drop, if this is true, which is a drop from the average of 20,000 in the fall and 40,000 when Russia was attacking Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the summer. I said 60,000. It depends who you listen to. So I think he's going probably on slightly more accurate numbers, to be honest, from American intelligence. It was the Ukrainian intelligence, I think, that were claiming that Russia was using 60,000 at their peak. Depends who you believe here. The Russian artillery is a basis of Russian war strategy, and the lack of artillery shells is forcing Russia to change tactics, sending infantry ahead without artillery support. You think that's not true? Well, interesting, because we've just been hearing exactly that from Igor Girkin, who has a lot of sources on the ground. In fact, he's been on the ground and seen it firsthand. So again, you hear a lot of pro-Russian pushback to this claim about Russian artillery and struggling to get ammunition, and they're saying, what's your proof of that? Well, the rate of fire has gone down. Russians are saying it themselves. We've got intercepts of Russians saying this, and we've got intelligence suggesting this. And HIMARS have been hitting ammunition depots and supply lines 10 a penny. So there's my evidence. What's your evidence of the other of your defense of that claim? Yeah, you haven't got any. Okay. Anyway, sorry, I'm ranting. It remains unclear if Russia can solve the artillery shell with supply problems as they have already taken part of the Belarusian shell storage, and the capacity of the Kremlin to mobilize the Russian military-industrial complex is questionable. Russia also have lost over 3,000 tanks, being forced to bring tanks from storage. Arestovych estimates that only 20% of 15,000 stored tanks can be used, resulting to cannibalism for tank parts. This process will also take some time. Meanwhile, Germany is increasing the production of tank and artillery shells, with only one company capable of producing with just one company being able to produce 450,000 shells per year. So there's a lot of ramping up, and America's ramping up production. Australia, I believe, is ramping up production. There's production being ramped up all over the place. Bulgaria. And so there's a far greater chance that Ukraine will have enough ammunition to continue firing at the rate they would desire. And in fact, at a greater rate, given that they're being given SPGs and howitzers to a large degree. And Russia will struggle going forward, unless, of course, North Korea, Iran, and or China. I wonder whether we know they're getting stuff from North Korea. That's pretty much being confirmed now. The question is whether the stuff from North Korea is actually coming from China. It's China's way of being able to help Russia by giving it to North Korea, and then North Korea giving it to Ukraine. That's just my speculation. Sorry, Russia. That's my speculation, though. Sorry to continue. Soon, Russia can end up in a situation where the Russian troops are outnumbered and technologically outgunned. I don't know that Russian troops will be outnumbered, given that they can have the mobilization, waves of mobilization, something that Russia has no strategy to cope with. And he goes on to say, Russian generals questioning their own next offensive. The Russian political elite is still planning to attack Liman and Bakhmut at the end of February or the beginning of March. Meanwhile, Russian generals are questioning their own potential, and there is talk of using the current forces to fortify the Russian defences instead of attempting another offensive operation, which would use up the critical Russian army resources. Ukraine is ready to defend and will harass Russian troops, depleting their military potential. Moreover, by May, Ukraine will be equipped with Western weapons, ready to retake and liberate all the Ukrainian territories. Thus, in the next 2 to 4 months, we could see catastrophic developments for the Russian army in Ukraine. Okay, this is looking at things from the most positive way you can for what is going on in Ukraine. This is a real pro Ukraine position, or at least kind of perspective, but it could be true as well. So if all the Western gear and ammunition is able to be supplied in a timely fashion to the Ukrainians ready for a counteroffensive, and if the Russians are struggling to get enough material for a really decent offensive of their own, is this why we're seeing half-assed attempts like I've been talking about? Then you could get to a position where in 3 to 4 months, the momentum might swing right back to the Ukrainians. At the moment, we are seeing a swing in momentum to the Russians as they are putting on offensive moves in and around the Kremen area, obviously in the Bakhmut area, in the Avdiivka area, in the Vuhledar area, and to some small degree in the Orikhiv area. But these are not big offensives. These are spoiling attacks. And are they using up their offensive potential, disallowing them to do one big offensive somewhere? I don't know. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. Now, on that point, it is worth, and I'm going on, I think I'm going to have to split this into two quite clearly today because I just can't stop talking. Massive apologies. ISW, this has in their daily report from last night, which doesn't have much detail about the intricacies of the front line, because it was Sunday and they don't do that. But there is some really fascinating talk which dovetails perfectly with what I've just been saying. So let's go through some of that. So delays in the provision of to Ukraine of Western long-range fire systems, advanced air defense systems and tanks have limited Ukraine's ability to take advantage of opportunities for larger counteroffensive operations presented by flaws and failures in the Russian military operations. So what this is saying is that there have been weaknesses that Ukraine can see that are coming out of maneuvers that are taking place on the front line, right? And in a perfect world, you'd be able to adapt in a really timely manner to that. You say, okay, I'm completely making this up, but maybe like 3 weeks ago, Kremlin was looking. I'm not completely making this up. There's something in this. So 3 weeks ago, before it was reinforced, Kremlin had some kind of. It was pretty weak, and it was ripe for maybe some attacks around the north and south of Kremlin. So if we go to Kremlin here, we started seeing Ukraine starting to push up here to the south, and we started seeing success around the Chervono-Pipivka area, around there. Now, if Ukraine had all the stuff that they've now been promised that's not going to get here till late spring, then you can imagine actually they could have just done a huge offensive, taken Kremina, and at the same time probably, surrounded Kremina, probably gone on to Starobilsk, or certainly taken Svatova, right? These are ripe for the picking, arguably, but they didn't have that stuff. And that's meant that they've not been able to take advantage of these weaknesses that have presented themselves in the decision making of the Russians, in where the Russians are at with their capability and capacity. So that's a real shame. It goes on to say factors endogenous to the Ukrainian military. So endogenous means from within. So you get in biology, you get endogenous retroviruses, which are retroviruses within our cells, viruses that are kind of almost junk DNA in our that we've inherited from ancestors previously. And previously, we've got like 7 endogenous retroviruses that chimpanzees have got as well, which shows that um, uh, we have common ancestors, right? Because we've both got these retroviruses that are endogenous. Anyway, that's completely random sidebar. Endogenous means from within. Exogenous means from without. Okay, whatever words. Jesus. Factors endogenous to the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian political decision making have also contributed to delaying counteroffensives. So, not only the idea that that Ukrainians don't have yet the capability that they want, that they are going to get these tanks, these bits of kit, this whatever, but they've also still got issues with political decision making and military decision making that is not perfect. And we've seen a lot of this. The interview of Willie OAM recently that I signposted talked about this idea that you know the Ukrainians aren't yet at this kind of perfect NATO model, and they're still like remnants of the Soviet decision making system, and there's still corruption, there's still these issues, and that gets in the way of successful maneuvers, and produces some bad decision making. In fact, I discussed with you the Zaluzhny, who's in charge of basically the armed forces of Ukraine. The interview he had with The Economist, saying that he's had to get rid of a load of like middle leaders, if you like, because they're not good enough. They're not making the right decisions. So it's not like the Ukrainian army is far from being this perfect thing that some people think, oh, they're amazing, they're so courageous, they're doing amazing, they're such better decision makers. They've got this NCO cadre that allow them, that enfranchise the lower ranks to make these reactive decisions. Yeah, in some places, and in a perfect world, yeah, that would be what they're like. But actually, they're not there yet. They're on the way to being there, but they're still a long way from that. And there are still some terrible decisions getting made by the Ukrainians on the front line that lead to bad outcomes. And it has been a bit of an up and down journey. Anyway, I digress. The military aid provided by the US-led Western coalition has been essential to Ukraine's survival, and this report's critiques illustrate the importance of that aid as well as its limitations. And again, the idea that, yeah, we're giving them all this stuff and that's great, but we haven't given them longer range than 84-kilometer missiles. And really, if we had, Ukraine would be in a different place. Yeah, great, but there are limitations to what we've given them, and that the knock-on effect is there are limitations to the successes of the Ukrainian forces. Western reluctance to begin supplying Ukraine with higher-end Western weapon systems, particularly tanks, long-range strike systems, and air defense systems, has limited Ukraine's ability to initiate and continue large-scale counteroffensive operations. True, not much more to say to that. We've not given them this stuff, and if we'd given them this stuff, they could have done more, and they could have already had some offensives being done. So we haven't given them soon enough and enough of the big stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Indicators that the Russian offensives would culminate and that Western weapons would be needed at scale emerged clearly in late May and June. So that there was all this talk about, what would happen. Some people predicting this back in May and June. If the West's aim had been to, and this is where it gets into like one of the theories I've been talking about, which is there's been this drip feeding of stuff rather than giving everything straight away, almost to bleed Russia dry more terminally, rather than go for a quick win and then Russia is able to come back to their former strength. You need to completely destroy the enemy or not be involved at all. You go halfway and it does neither, and then they come back at you even angrier. So, if the West's aim had been to shorten the war by speeding Ukraine's liberation of occupied territory, the assessment that stocks of Soviet era weapons held by friendly states were running low should have triggered a fundamental change in the provision of Western aid starting in June 2022. But it just didn't. And it goes on to discuss that at great depth. Well worth reading this, by the way. And I know some people are not fans of the ISW, but there's interesting discussion to be had in all of these points. The Russians have taken advantage of these delayed and failures to benefit from the windows of vulnerability, uh, their own defeats and incompetence produced by mobilizing manpower and equipment and starting to rationalize their own forces. It's a bit of a confusing sentence there. So the Russians have taken advantage of these delays and failures to benefit from the windows of vulnerability. Uh, their own defeats, yeah, there's some grammatical issue there, but basically Russia are now arguably looking at the fact that there's delays and are thinking, right, now's the time to do these spoiling attacks. Now's the time to probe. Now's the time to maybe do a sort of maybe a major counterattack, maybe a sort of counterattack in the Kremlin area. Who knows? Like they are adapting. It could be to the delay to the Ukrainians getting these weapons. And the continual delays in providing Western material when it became apparent that it is or will soon be needed have thus contributed to the protraction of the conflict. This conflict is becoming protracted and drawn out, and it didn't have to be so, so the ISW claims, if we'd just given this stuff earlier. We've waited and waited and ended up giving it possibly because we were scared of nuclear escalation. But when we realised that was going to happen, we've now started sort of giving this stuff. Well, actually, hindsight is always 2020, but if we had done that 6 months ago, we might be in a very different place now. Recent Western commitments to provide Ukraine with the tanks and armoured vehicles it requires for further counter-offensive operations are important, but the delays in making those commitments may have cost Ukraine a window of opportunity for a counter-offensive this winter. And indeed, it's certainly looking like it's going to be spring, late spring, that's going to happen. The West will, which is what they were saying, it shouldn't happen then, because that's when you've got your Rasputitsa, or the Ukrainian word equivalent. You've got the muds, the thawing muds. You want to attack when the ground is hard. Like winter is actually a better time to attack than spring. The West will need to avoid drawing the erroneous conclusion that future Iranian counteroffensives are impossible based on a timeline imposed by the West's own delays in providing necessary material and meteorological conditions. The idea that they wouldn't want to attack in winter. Actually, no, probably would want to attack in winter given the ground conditions. Oh, goodness me. Anyway, that's probably enough for me for now because I have gone on. I will give you the second half of this because, look, I've got all of this stuff to talk about up there. And yeah, anyway, I hope this is of interest to you. Please like, subscribe, and share. And also, I ask you to go and check out Arestovych channel, not only just because it's a great channel and has some interesting views on what is happening in Ukraine from a Ukrainian's point of view, and from people within Ukraine, both foreigners like Croatians helping out and so on, but other people, just general public. But he's also interviewed me, and you can see what you think about that. I think I really enjoyed that interview. Just a short half an hour one. But yeah, go and check that out on Arestovych YouTube channel and subscribe to him and his work. Anyway, thanks so much for your support. Check you later.